So, I mean, if you break your arm, right, an X-ray shows a pretty clear, clean, jagged line.
Right, yeah.
It's totally binary. Like,
Yeah.
it's either broken or it's not broken. And there was this, I don't know, a profound comfort in that kind of diagnostic precision.
Oh, absolutely. It's visible.
Exactly. You put a cast on it, the bone knits itself back together, and, 6 weeks later, you are healed. The injury is visible, the treatment is totally standardized, and the recovery is predictable.
Yeah.
But what happens when the injury is not a snapped bone but a fractured mind? And what happens when that fracture isn't just in, like, one isolated person, but in 1 out of every 5 people in an entire city?
That is the real question, yeah.
Because today, for this deep dive, we are looking at the invisible epidemic of humanitarian crises. We are going to examine the psychological toll that emergencies take on human beings, and more importantly, how you even begin to rebuild the social fabric of a community when the very minds of its people have been subjected to just unimaginable stress.
And, it really requires a complete reversal of how we typically view a disaster.
How so?
Well, think about it. When a hurricane hits or a conflict breaks out, the cameras naturally gravitate toward the visual spectacle of destruction.
Right, the 24-hour news cycle stuff.
Exactly. We see the collapsed bridges, the flooded neighborhoods, the rubble. That physical infrastructure is basically the X-ray of the community.
Well, that makes sense.
But the far more complex challenge, and honestly, the one that dictates whether a society can actually recover at all, is the invisible destruction occurring within the nervous systems of the survivors.
Wow. And to understand that invisible destruction, we are pulling from 2 incredibly dense foundational sources for this deep dive.
2 really excellent sources, yeah.
First, we have an extensive on-the-ground presentation. It's titled Mental Health and Psychosocial Perspectives, Working with Communities. And it was delivered by Rachel Miller in May 2026.
Right.
Which operates almost like I guess you call it a tactical field manual for humanitarian actors dealing with psychological recovery.
That's a great way to describe it.
And paired with that, we have this landmark study from the World Health Organization. It is a systematic review and meta-analysis on mental disorders in conflict settings, published by Charlson and colleagues in 2019.
Yeah, and that WHO study is fundamentally important because it basically acts as the baseline for everything else.
Okay, how do you mean?
Well, it replaced global data that was over a decade old at that point. It completely recalculated the true psychological burden of war and disaster.
Wow, okay.
So it provides the scale of the problem, while the Miller presentation kind of provides the methodology for the solution.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with that scale. Because the data in this WHO study completely short-circuits how you might normally think about emergency response.
It really does.
According to the Charlson Review, if you look at populations that have experienced conflict within the past 10 years, the prevalence of mental disorders at any given time is 22.1%.
Yeah.
And just to be absolutely clear on what we are measuring here, they are tracking depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. 22.1%.
So over 1 in 5 people.
Yeah, over 1 in 5 people. I want to scale this to something tangible for you listening.
Right.
Imagine your own town, right? Let's say a massive sudden catastrophe occurs. In the aftermath, 1 out of every 5 people you see at the grocery store, at your workplace, dropping their kids off at school.
It's just everyday people.
Exactly. 1 out of every 5 of those people suddenly has a broken leg. The logistical nightmare of treating that would consume the entire city's resources. Right?
Oh, without a doubt. It would be the only thing anyone talked about.
It would be a relentless, visible crisis.
Yeah.
But because mental health is invisible, that 22.1% often simply goes unaccounted for in the initial rush of aid.
Right. And that lack of accounting is exactly what the WHO study was designed to fix. Because the researchers didn't just look at previous estimates and make like an educated guess. They utilized something called Bayesian meta-regression techniques.
Okay, let's stop right there and unpack that. Because Bayesian meta-regression is exactly the kind of statistical jargon that makes people's eyes glaze over.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
What does that actually mean in the context of, counting psychological injuries in a war zone?
So think of it like a highly sophisticated statistical sieve.
A sieve, okay.
Right. When you gather data from dozens of different studies across totally different conflict zones, say a study from Syria, one from Afghanistan, another from Colombia, the data is incredibly messy. Older methodologies might have accidentally double-counted people.
Oh, I see. How would they double count?
Well, for instance, if someone is suffering from both severe anxiety and PTSD, older, cruder counts might record that as two separate instances of mental illness.
Oh, which would artificially inflate the overall numbers.
Exactly. Or, conversely, they might not account for the fact that older populations naturally have different baseline rates of certain cognitive issues than younger populations.
So it's basically a way to clean the noise out of the data.
Precisely. By using this meta-regression, they rigorously adjusted for age and comorbidities. They filtered out all the overlaps and the statistical anomalies to arrive at a truly accurate, deeply conservative, age-standardized picture.
So it's a rock-solid number.
Yes. When they say 22.1%, it is a mathematically hardened number. It is not an exaggeration.
And the study breaks that 22.1% down further into severity.
It does, yes.
Because obviously there is a vast spectrum between mild anxiety and, say, severe schizophrenia.
Right. It breaks down into 3 specific categories. What's fascinating here is how clearly the data delineates the burden. It shows a 13.0% prevalence for mild forms of depression, anxiety, and PTSD.
Okay, 13% mild.
Then a 4.0% prevalence for moderate forms of those exact same conditions.
So that is 17% of the population dealing with mild to moderate disruptions. That leaves roughly 5% unaccounted for.
Yes. The comorbidity-adjusted point prevalence for severe disorders is 5.1%.
Wow.
And this category includes schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, severe anxiety, and severe PTSD.
5.1%.
Yeah.
I mean, 1 in 20 people in a conflict zone dealing with severe, potentially debilitating mental disorders. I am just trying to picture the reality of that.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
If someone is dealing with severe schizophrenia, their grasp on reality is already fundamentally compromised.
Exactly.
To experience that while your physical environment is literally exploding around you,
Right.
while access to medication is completely severed, I mean, the level of vulnerability is almost incomprehensible.
It really is. And the sources actually note a huge methodological hurdle regarding those specific conditions, too.
What's the hurdle?
Well, gathering primary epidemiological data on psychosis in the middle of a kinetic war zone is nearly impossible.
Right. I mean, you can't just hand out clipboards during a firefight.
Exactly. You cannot set up a clinical study while artillery is falling. So for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder specifically, the researchers had to rely on existing global burden of disease estimates and basically adapt them.
That makes sense.
But the core takeaway remains devastatingly clear. The societal burden is massive.
And this is where the traditional Western model of therapy just breaks down mathematically, right?
Oh, completely. It shatters.
Because if a community has a 22.1% prevalence of mental disorders, you cannot solve that with one-on-one therapy.
No.
You can't just fly in a battalion of psychiatrists, set up a tent, and schedule an hour a week for 1/5 of an entire city.
The math simply does not work.
Yeah.
There literally aren't enough clinicians on the planet to do that.
Right.
This is the massive humanitarian imperative the sources are pointing toward. We are looking at a societal-level injury that requires scalable, population-level interventions.
Because if you don't fix that...
Right, because if 1 in 5 adults in a community is incapacitated by trauma, you cannot rebuild the economy. You cannot staff the schools. You cannot form a functioning local government.
So the psychological recovery is the prerequisite for the physical recovery.
Absolutely. You can't rebuild the buildings if the people are completely broken.
So if 22.1% is the destination, how does a community actually get there? Because a number on a spreadsheet feels very static, but trauma is incredibly dynamic.
It's extremely dynamic.
How does a disaster actually dismantle normalcy on the ground?
To understand the mechanics of that dismantling, the Miller presentation outlines what we can call the ripple effect.
The ripple effect.
Yeah. It is a framework that forces us to look beyond just the individual. Because an emergency doesn't just strike a person in a vacuum, right?
Right.
It strikes the entire ecosystem that sustains human life. And they categorize this disruption into 3 distinct levels.
Let's start at the center of the ripple.
Yeah.
The individual level.
So this is the immediate visceral impact: high distress, acute anxiety, traumatic stress.
The physiological reaction.
Exactly. It is the raw biological and psychological shock of the event itself hitting the individual's nervous system.
Okay, then you zoom out to the family level.
Right. At this level, the disaster severs the primary unit of human support. Family life is completely interrupted.
Yeah.
The presentation highlights the specific trauma of children being separated from their caregivers in the chaos, which is just,
I can't even imagine.
it's horrific. And then there is the sudden catastrophic financial hardship as livelihoods just disappear overnight, which places immense crushing stress on the family structure.
And zooming out one more time, we hit the community level.
This is where we see the macro level destruction of the social fabric. It involves mass displacement, entire neighborhoods forced to migrate.
It's picking up and leaving everything.
Right. But beyond the physical movement, it is the destruction of the community's rhythm.
What do you mean by rhythm?
Traditional events, festivals, religious rites, the communal gatherings that a society uses to bond, to mourn, and to process life.
Oh, wow.
All the mechanisms a community naturally relies on to heal itself are suddenly gone.
I want to pause here, actually, because this directly contradicts a very persistent narrative we see in media coverage of disasters.
Oh, the utopia narrative.
Yes.
Yeah.
We love the post-disaster utopia storyline. The idea that a hurricane hits and suddenly everyone is out in the streets helping their neighbors, sharing food, and transcending all their prior divisions.
Right.
It is a comforting thought, but the source material seems to be pouring cold water on it. Is that right?
It is a really critical distinction to make. While acts of immense altruism and mutual aid absolutely occur, and they are vital, don't get me wrong,
Sure.
the structural reality of a severe emergency is that it acts as a profound destabilizer. The Miller presentation explicitly notes that emergencies amplify pre-existing problems.
So if a community had cracks in the foundation before the earthquake turns them into chasms.
Exactly. If there was already tension between different ethnic groups or deep economic inequality or marginalization of certain populations,
The disaster acts as an accelerant.
yes. Furthermore, the emergency actively erodes what the framework calls normally protective factors.
Protective factors being things like steady income, a reliable police force, strong social networks.
Yes, the everyday structures that buffer us from stress, those are stripped away. And simultaneously, the crisis forces risk factors to skyrocket.
Like what?
You have sudden, deep poverty. You have displacement, overcrowding in camps, a desperate scramble for limited resources, and deeply concerning spikes in issues like gender-based violence.
So you are basically losing your armor at the exact moment you are thrust into a battle.
That's a perfect way to put it.
When those protective factors evaporate, how do people physically and mentally react?
Sure.
Because the presentation goes into a lot of detail, categorizing the chaos of common reactions, making it clear that trauma is not just a synonym for sadness.
Far from it. It's not just feeling sad. The reactions are a complex cascade of system failures across emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and physical domains.
Let's walk through the mechanisms of these. Emotionally, the sources list things like fear, anxiety, and the dread of recurrence, which seem intuitive.
Right.
But they also list anger, guilt, and anhedonia. How does anhedonia function in this context?
Anhedonia is incredibly insidious. It is the literal inability to feel pleasure.
So it's not sadness?
No, it's not sadness. It is a profound, hollow numbness. Neurologically, the brain's reward centers essentially shut down.
Wow.
Things that used to provide comfort or joy, the taste of a favorite food, holding a child, talking with a friend, they elicit absolutely no emotional response.
Why did the brain do that?
The nervous system is so overloaded by the trauma that it dampens all emotional resonance just to survive. It's a defense mechanism that goes too far.
And that leads right into the cognitive reactions, which I find fascinating because we rarely think of trauma as an intelligence issue or a processing issue.
Right.
But it literally breaks your cognitive function. Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources list impaired concentration and impaired memory. So how does a bombing or a flood actually affect someone's ability to remember a simple instruction or like a phone number?
It comes down to how the brain prioritizes survival.
Okay.
During a severe trauma, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, hijacks the entire system.
It takes over.
Completely. It floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol, shifting all resources into fight or flight. Because the brain is dedicating all its energy to scanning for the next immediate threat, the hippocampus.
The memory part.
Right. The part of the brain responsible for filing away new memories and consolidating information is effectively sidelined. It cannot do its job.
Oh, wow.
So a person might be sitting in a safe tent 2 days after a disaster, but they physically cannot remember the conversation they had 5 minutes ago because their brain hasn't turned the recording equipment back on yet.
That is terrifying. They are also experiencing dissociation and intrusive thoughts, right?
Yes. Dissociation is the brain basically pulling the plug on reality. When the present moment becomes too psychologically agonizing to endure, the brain creates a sense of detachment from one's own body or surroundings as a defense mechanism.
You just check out.
Exactly. Intrusive thoughts are the opposite problem. The brain cannot stop looping the traumatic memory, forcing the person to re-experience the terror against their will.
Over and over again.
Yes. Add to that hypervigilance the exhausting state of being perpetually on high alert, and you see how cognitive functions simply collapses.
Which explains the behavioral and physical reactions. Behaviorally, the sources note regression, particularly in children who might suddenly start bedwetting or losing language skills.
Right.
There is withdrawal, severe irritability, and interpersonal conflict.
And physically, the trauma manifests in the body. Insomnia, hyperarousal, reduced appetite. But the most telling physical reaction mentioned in the sources is the prevalence of somatic complaints.
Somatic complaints meaning physical pain that doesn't have a clear physical injury attached to it.
Yes. Unexplained headaches, severe stomach issues, chest pain.
Just from the stress.
Exactly. When the mind cannot articulate or process the sheer volume of psychological distress, the nervous system overflows and the body expresses the trauma as literal physical pain. The emotional wound becomes a physical symptom.
Okay, so we have this massive spectrum of reactions. Emotional numbness, cognitive failure, behavioral regression, physical pain.
It's a lot.
But this brings us to a really difficult question. If trauma causes all of these predictable system failures, why is the fallout so uneven? Like if an entire neighborhood is hit by a tsunami, why does one person develop severe PTSD and somatic pain, while their neighbor across the street experiences acute distress, but eventually returns to their baseline functioning?
That variance is the core puzzle of psychosocial support. And the Miller presentation uses a brilliant defining metaphor to explain it.
Same storm, different boat.
Exactly. The crisis, the storm, is an objective reality hitting everyone. But the boat you are navigating that storm in your personal, social, and environmental context dictates whether you stay afloat or capsize.
That makes perfect sense.
The presentation breaks down the architecture of these boats into 4 distinct categories of variables.
Let's analyze the first variable, the characteristics of the event. Because not all storms are created equal, psychologically speaking.
No, they aren't. The nature of the crisis heavily dictates the depth of the wound. The most fundamental distinction they draw is between natural disasters and man-made disasters.
So an earthquake versus an armed conflict.
Yes, and the psychological difference hinges on the concept of intentionality.
This is a profound distinction, because if a massive storm destroys your home, you'll experience terrible grief, fear, and loss. But you generally process it as an act of nature, right?
Right.
There is no malice in a hurricane. But if a neighboring group intentionally burns your house down or forces you to flee under the threat of violence, the psychological injury is completely different.
It is. Intentionality shatters the fundamental social contract. It introduces a deep existential betrayal.
A betrayal.
Yeah, a natural disaster damages your environment. A man-made disaster damages your basic trust in humanity. It is vastly more difficult to heal from the realization that other human beings actively desire to cause you harm.
The sources also tie this into the degree of preventability. And this connects to a point that always fascinated me regarding the aftermath of a crisis.
What's that?
The presentation explicitly lists perceived lack of justice and litigation as compounding factors.
Right.
Why does litigation make trauma worse? I mean, shouldn't justice be healing?
You'd think so, but litigation traps the victim in the acute phase of the trauma.
How?
Well, if a disaster was preventable, say, a dam collapsed due to documented government corruption, the survivors cannot just grieve and move on. They are locked in a battle for accountability.
Right.
To fight a legal battle, you have to constantly revisit the trauma, continually prove your victimhood, and remain in a state of adversarial high alert.
So you never get to power down.
Exactly. The litigation process itself becomes a secondary chronic trauma that prevents the nervous system from ever returning to baseline.
Okay, so that is the nature of the storm itself. The second category determining the impact is the crisis or post-crisis environment, the literal physical reality of the aftermath.
Right. The environment acts as an immediate amplifier or dampener of the initial shock. The sources point out incredibly specific factors like the weather and the time of day the event occurred.
I hadn't considered that, but the psychological difference between a chemical spill happening at noon on a clear, sunny day versus an earthquake striking at 3:00 a.m. in the pitch black during a freezing rainstorm.
It's night and day, literally.
The latter is infinitely more terrifying.
The darkness and the cold compound the helplessness. They also factor in the accessibility to the area, how quickly can help actually arrive, the sheer volume of physical destruction, and, most devastatingly, the mortality rate.
And the presentation singles out one specific metric of mortality that carries the absolute heaviest psychological weight for a community.
Yes, the number of child deaths.
Why does that specific metric fracture a community so uniquely?
Because it violates the deepest biological and social imperatives of the human species. Protecting the next generation is the foundational purpose of a community.
Right.
When a disaster results in high child mortality, it doesn't just cause profound grief. It induces a collective sense of ultimate failure.
Wow.
It represents the literal death of the community's future, which can entirely extinguish hope and resilience on a macro level.
Which brings us to the third category, individual characteristics. If the first two categories were the storm and the ocean, this is the strength of the hull on your personal boat.
This is where pre-disaster vulnerabilities become critical. Age and stage of life are major determinants.
Obviously.
The way a 6-year-old processes a bombing is vastly different from how a 30-year-old or an 80-year-old processes it.
The sources also list pre-existing mental health.
Right.
Like if you were already battling clinical depression before the floodwaters rose, your capacity to absorb that new shock is drastically reduced.
Yes.
But they also list socioeconomic status. We often think of trauma as the great equalizer, but money actually buys a thicker hull, doesn't it?
It really does. Socioeconomic status is a tremendous psychological shield.
How so?
If you have financial resources during a crisis, you have agency. You can buy a plane ticket out of the conflict zone. You can afford to stay in a hotel rather than a crowded refugee camp. You can purchase private medical care.
And if you don't have that money?
Poverty strips away agency. It forces you to rely entirely on overburdened external aid, which drastically increases feelings of helplessness and prolonged stress.
The final category is family and community resources. These are the life jackets and the crew members.
Having an active social network, strong community cohesion, and intact family units acts as a massive buffer against trauma. But the presentation also specifically highlights the role of religious systems and rites.
I was wondering about that. How does religion function as a psychosocial tool in an emergency?
It provides a pre-existing framework for meaning-making.
Meaning-making?
Yeah. When a disaster shatters the logic of everyday life, religious frameworks often provide a way to understand suffering, a communal structure for mourning, and specific rituals to process grief.
So it's a structural support.
Yes. When those systems are intact, resilience is higher. When those community leaders or physical places of worship are destroyed, a major psychological anchor is lost.
So if we look at the entire fleet of boats out in this storm, factoring in the event, the environment, personal wealth, and community support, who is sitting in the most fragile vessels?
The Miller presentation provides a clear list of at-risk groups.
Who are they?
These are the populations whose protective factors are structurally the lowest and whose risk factors are exponentially highest. Humanitarian response must identify them immediately.
The list starts with women, specifically highlighting pregnant women, mothers, and single mothers. Then children, with a stark emphasis on separated or unaccompanied children.
Right. A child navigating a disaster zone without a primary caregiver is experiencing maximum unbuffered trauma. They have no conceptual framework to understand what is happening and no biological safety net.
The sources also list older adults, but they add a very specific, devastating caveat. Older adults who have lost family members who were their primary caregivers.
It is a profound vulnerability.
Yeah.
If you are elderly, perhaps with mobility issues, and you rely entirely on your adult children for food, shelter, and medical care, and those children are killed or separated from you in a crisis,
You have nothing.
you are left entirely defenseless in an environment that requires maximum physical exertion to survive.
The list continues with refugees, internally displaced persons, and migrants who, by definition, have lost their physical community.
Right.
It includes people with pre-existing severe physical, neurological, or mental disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And it points out people residing in institutions such as orphanages or psychiatric care facilities who are often simply abandoned when the infrastructure collapses.
It is a really comprehensive map of societal fragility. But the source material also forces us to look at another group one that we rarely view as vulnerable.
The humanitarian staff.
Yeah.
The people who fly into the storm.
Exactly. The aid workers, the medical staff, the logisticians, They are not immune to the psychological fallout.
Not at all.
The presentation cites data from Regal et al. 2017, which tracks the trajectory of common reactions for staff, particularly in the acute phase, which is defined as the first 3 months post-event.
And what I found striking is that it isn't just a generalized stress of the job. The data shows that staff experience far greater psychological damage under very specific, identifiable conditions.
Yes. The trauma spikes significantly when the crisis involves high numbers of children, older adults, or people with disabilities.
The most vulnerable.
Right. It also spikes when colleagues are injured or killed.
But there are two internal organizational factors that the data flags as particularly damaging. The first is when staff carry a sense of, I should have done more.
Survivor's guilt, basically, or professional guilt. When the sheer scale of the need outpaces the resources, aid workers inevitably have to make impossible triage decisions. Living with the consequences of those decisions is a heavy psychological burden.
And the second factor is what they call organizational indifference.
This is perhaps the most preventable trauma of all.
How does that happen?
It occurs when staff experience little or no perceived support from their families, friends, or, crucially, their employers.
So the organization just burns them out.
Exactly. When an organization treats its workers as expendable machines, demanding they absorb endless trauma and then sending them back into the field without acknowledge or care, the psychological breakdown is rapid and severe.
It's the lack of duty of care. The system designed to heal others will consume its own people if it doesn't protect their minds.
Precisely.
Okay, let's take a breath and survey where we are. We have established the massive statistical scale of the problem, over 22% of conflict populations suffering mental disorders. We've traced the biological and social mechanisms of how trauma ripples through a community, breaking memory, shutting down emotion, and amplifying pain.
Yes.
We've mapped out the different boats, identifying who is most likely to capsize. Knowing all of this, knowing how deep and complex these invisible wounds are, how does the global community actually attempt to fix it?
That's the million-dollar question.
And because, as we established, airdropping 50,000 psychiatrists isn't an option.
And even if it were an option, the source material argues that it would be the wrong approach.
Really?
Yes. This is where we encounter a massive paradigm shift in humanitarian response, a shift away from a strictly medicalized Western perspective of mental health.
Enter the MHPSS framework.
Mental health and psychosocial support.
The Miller presentation defines MHPSS, drawing from the 2007 IASC guidelines as any type of local or outside support that aims to protect or promote psychosocial well-being and or prevent mental disorder.
Right.
On the surface, that sounds incredibly broad, almost too broad.
It is intentionally broad, actually, because the core philosophy of MHPSS is that healing does not exclusively or even primarily happen in a clinician's office.
Okay.
To truly understand this framework, we have to look at the presentation's profound explanation of what MHPSS actually is, contrasted with what it is not.
I was really struck by the language used here. The presentation states that MHPSS is permission-giving and about giving language or meaning to what we feel, but might not yet be able to say.
Yes.
It also focuses on recognizing each experience as unique while finding the commonalities. How does giving language function as a medical or psychological intervention?
It is about regulating the nervous system through validation.
Validation.
Right. In the immediate aftermath of a massive trauma, a person's internal landscape is pure chaos. They might be experiencing memory loss, uncontrollable rage, or physical tremors.
Yeah.
Because they have never experienced this before, their secondary thought is often, I'm losing my mind, I am going permanently crazy.
Which just makes the panic worse.
Exactly. That secondary fear spikes their cortisol even further.
So the intervention is stepping in and saying, you are not broken.
Exactly. MHPSS provides a framework for an aid worker or a community leader to say, the memory loss, the numbness, the anger. What you are feeling is a completely normal human reaction to an extraordinarily abnormal and horrific event.
By giving language to the chaos, you remove the secondary fear of madness.
You validate their reality, which is the first necessary step to bringing the nervous system out of fight or flight.
And the sources draw a hard line against the opposite approach. They explicitly state what MHPSS is not. And the first point is crucial. MHPSS is not pathologizing.
This is the core of the paradigm shift. Pathologizing is treating a normal human response to trauma as a medical disease that needs to be diagnosed and cured with a pill.
It's the danger of a doctor walking into a refugee camp, seeing someone weeping inconsolably because their house burned down and their brother is missing, and saying, "You meet the criteria for clinical depression. Let me write you a prescription."
Precisely. That is pathologizing grief. MHPSS dictates that you do not immediately slap a psychiatric label on acute distress.
Right?
The framework also emphasizes that MHPSS is not forcing people into rigid Western models or predetermined stages of grief. Healing is not linear, and imposing a strict psychological schedule on a survivor is counterproductive.
So if the goal isn't to diagnose everyone, what is the actual measurable goal of MHPSS?
The presentation outlines a few core characteristics: mobilizing the power of humanity, relieving emotional and physical suffering, improving a person's immediate ability to function under stress, and reducing long-term negative effects.
Notice the deliberate pragmatism in that phrasing. Improving a person's immediate ability to function under stress.
Yeah.
The goal in a disaster zone is not achieving perfect self-actualization or profound inner peace.
No, not at all.
The goal is providing enough psychological scaffolding so that a mother can find the energy to stand in the waterline, or a father can focus enough to build a temporary shelter. It is about restoring basic human functioning. So how do you operationalize that? How do you organize a system that provides permission-giving and improved functioning for hundreds of thousands of displaced people at once?
To explain the logistics, the sources introduce a visual model that acts as the blueprint for all humanitarian psychological response.
The IAC MHPSS intervention pyramid.
Right.
If there is one concept from this entire deep dive to burn into your memory, it is this pyramid. You can think of it like a triage system or Maslow's hierarchy of needs for disaster recovery. It has a very wide base tapering up to a tiny tip.
And the absolute unbreakable rule of the pyramid is you cannot start at the top.
You cannot build a roof if you haven't poured the foundation.
Exactly. If you try to parachute psychiatrists into a crisis without establishing the bottom layers of the pyramid, the intervention will collapse.
So let's pour the foundation. The bottom layer, level 1 of the pyramid, is labeled social considerations and basic services and security.
To a layperson, this does not sound like mental health care.
It sounds like logistics.
Right, it sounds like logistics. But the source framework insists it is the bedrock of psychological recovery.
Okay.
Level 1 is essentially about advocacy. It is the mandate that basic services, food, water, shelter, latrines, must be delivered in a way that is safe, socially appropriate, and fiercely protects human dignity.
Let's draw a direct line between basic logistics and neurobiology. Give me a concrete example of how moving a water pump is a mental health intervention.
Okay, imagine a massive displacement camp.
Sure.
If the communal latrines and the food distribution lines are set up on the outskirts of the camp in areas with no lighting and no security patrols, what happens?
They become dangerous.
Very dangerous. Women and girls are routinely harassed, assaulted, or terrified every time they need to meet their basic biological needs.
So their environment keeps them in a perpetual state of hypervigilance.
Exactly. Their amygdala is constantly firing. Their cortisol levels never drop. In that physiological state, you cannot provide therapy. You cannot ask a woman to process her grief in a support group if she is currently terrified that she will be assaulted when she walks back to her tent. The trauma is ongoing.
So level 1 MHPSS intervention isn't a counselor. It's an advocate demanding that camp management move the latrines to a central, well-lit, secure location.
Yes. By making the delivery of basic services safe, you remove the immediate, ongoing threat.
Wow.
You allow the nervous system to finally recognize that it is safe to power down the fight or flight response. Restoring basic dignity through safe logistics is the most widespread, profound psychological intervention you can make in an emergency.
That completely reframes the entire concept of aid for me.
It's powerful.
Okay, so the foundation is secure. People are physically safe when getting food. We move up to level 2 of the pyramid, strengthening community and family supports.
Once the immediate physical threat is mitigated, the focus shifts to repairing the boats, those life jackets we discussed earlier. This level is largely implemented by community members themselves, often facilitated by outside aid organizations.
The sources outline the tactics for level 2. Activating social networks, setting up child-friendly spaces, facilitating communal traditional supports, and crucially, promoting everyday activities like schooling.
Getting children back into a routine is paramount.
Why is that so critical?
Establishing a makeshift school in a tent isn't just about education. It is a profound psychosocial signal. Routine signals predictability to the brain. When a child attends a structured activity every day, their brain begins to understand that the chaos has subsided.
That makes total sense.
Furthermore, it gives the parents a few hours to breathe, to grieve, or to organize their resources without having to constantly shield their children from their own distress. Level 2 is about organically rebuilding the connective tissue of the community.
Moving further up, the pyramid narrows. Level 3, focused, person-to-person, non-specialized supports.
We are now identifying the individuals who are still significantly struggling despite having safe, basic services and community routines.
Okay.
But the key word here is non-specialized.
Right. You still haven't brought in the psychiatrist.
No, not yet.
The sources state that Level 3 involves trained social workers and general health staff providing on-site psychological first aid. It involves basic emotional and practical support delivered by primary healthcare doctors.
It is a strategy of utilizing the existing workforce. A primary care nurse who is treating a physical wound can be trained to recognize the signs of acute psychological distress.
Okay.
They can be trained to provide structured, empathetic, listening psychological first aid without needing an advanced degree in psychology.
So a social worker in a child-friendly space can pull a withdrawn child aside for targeted basic emotional support.
Yeah.
It is scalable care.
Exactly.
And finally, we reach the very top of the pyramid, Level 4, the tiny, narrow tip, specialized services.
This level is reserved for the very small percentage of the population whose psychological suffering is so severe, so complex, or so debilitating that it exceeds the capacities of general health workers and community networks.
This is where you deploy your mental health care specialists, psychiatric nurses, clinical psychologists, and psychiatrists.
Yes.
But there is a massive operational detail in the source material regarding when this happens.
A very important detail.
The presentation explicitly notes that workers, such as those running child-friendly spaces, refer individuals to these Level 4 specialized services for clinical diagnosis if they're still not showing signs of improvement 6 to 8 weeks after the emergency.
That timeline, waiting 6 to 8 weeks, is the ultimate safeguard against pathologizing normal grief.
Explain the logic of that waiting period, if you would.
In the first few weeks after a catastrophic event, a person might exhibit extreme distress. They might be unable to sleep, suffering from intrusive memories, weeping constantly, and entirely unable to function.
Right, which sounds like PTSD.
Exactly. In a Western clinical setting, those symptoms might trigger an immediate diagnosis of PTSD or severe depression. But in a disaster zone, that is considered a normal, acute stress reaction.
So you don't diagnose someone with a disorder on day 5 of a war.
You do not. Instead, you let the pyramid work. You provide them with Level 1 basic safety. You surround them with Level 2 community support. You offer Level 3 psychological first aid.
And then?
And you give their natural human resilience time to process the shock. The vast majority of people, when provided with a safe environment and community support, will begin to stabilize organically.
But if they don't?
If 2 months pass, and despite the safety and the community support, those severe symptoms have not abated, if they are still entirely immobilized by trauma, then it indicates that their natural healing process has stalled.
I see.
Only then do you refer them to Level 4 for specialized clinical psychiatric intervention.
If we pull back and look at the whole picture, this massive pyramid operating across an entire disaster zone, it becomes incredibly clear that MHPSS is not a standalone department.
Oh, not at all.
You can't just assign this to the medical tent and consider the job done.
No, the presentation strongly emphasizes that MHPSS sits uncomfortably but necessarily between various traditional humanitarian sectors. It requires radical integration.
The sources list the overlaps. MHPSS must integrate with healthcare and nutrition, obviously.
Yes.
But also with child protection, gender-based violence programs, education, and even highly technical sectors like mine action and shelter construction.
Consider the mine action example.
Okay.
If an entire village is traumatized by the presence of unexploded ordnance in their fields, a psychologist cannot treat their anxiety through talk therapy.
Because the threat is real.
Right. The anxiety is a logical response to a literal threat.
Yeah.
The psychosocial support team must coordinate with the demining logistics team.
Oh, wow.
The psychological intervention relies on the physical clearing of the threat. Coordination is the lifeblood of the framework.
And to ensure this massive multi-sector coordination doesn't veer off course, the IASC guidelines provide a set of core principles that every intervention must follow.
These principles act as the guardrails for the pyramid.
Let's run through them. First, promoting human rights and equity. Second, participation and promoting self-efficacy, which goes back to restoring agency.
Right.
Third, the classic do no harm. Fourth, building on available resources rather than replacing them. Fifth, ensuring multi-layered integrated support systems, which is the pyramid itself. And finally, building local capacities.
And how do humanitarian actors ensure they're actually adhering to these principles? The presentation draws a vital operational distinction between two concepts that are often conflated: monitoring and evaluation.
Yes, the sources separate these clearly. Monitoring is the real-time pulse check.
Exactly.
It refers to the site visits, the observations, and the data collected while a program is actively running. It answers the question, are we delivering the services we promised in the way we promised?
Evaluation, conversely, is the deep analysis of impact. It occurs at specific milestones, the beginning, the midpoint, and the end of a program.
So it's looking at the actual results.
Yes. It answers the fundamental question. Did this intervention actually work? Did we reduce suffering and improve functioning, or did we just distribute resources without changing outcomes? Evaluation measures the actual psychosocial change.
Well, we have journeyed through an immense amount of complex, heavy material today.
We really have.
We started by dismantling the myth that disaster trauma is rare, looking at the rigorous, mathematically hardened WHO data proving that over 22% of populations in conflict zones suffer from mental disorders.
Right. The sheer scale of it.
We then explored the mechanics of the destruction, how an emergency creates a ripple effect, dismantling the protective scaffolding of society while triggering a cascade of emotional numbness, cognitive failure, and physical pain within the individual.
Yes, that internal chaos.
We examine the inequality of survival through the different boats metaphor, recognizing that the nature of the storm, the physical environment, personal wealth, and community structure ultimately determine who sinks and who swims.
And finally, we unpack the MHPSS paradigm shift.
Right. The realization that healing a fractured society isn't achieved by pathologizing normal grief or deploying armies of psychiatrists, but through a meticulously constructed pyramid of support that begins with basic safety and dignity, builds through community routine, and only utilizes clinical diagnosis as a last resort.
It is a massive shift in thinking.
Understanding this fundamentally changes how you process international news.
I hope so.
The next time a crisis flashes across your screen, I encourage you to look past the visible rubble. Look past the broken bridges.
Because there's so much more going on.
Recognize that the true crisis is the invisible neurological shockwave hitting the population. And recognize that when aid workers fight for safe latrines or set up a makeshift school, they are not just providing logistics, they are performing vital, life-saving mental health care.
It broadens our entire definition of what it means to heal a mind. And I think it leaves us with a final, rather profound question to consider regarding our own lives.
I'm ready. What is the final thought for our listeners?
If the global humanitarian community working in the most extreme crucibles of war and disaster has mathematically proven that the foundational bedrock of mental health is not a clinical diagnosis, but rather safe, basic services, community connection, and human dignity.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about how we address the everyday mental health crises in our own peaceful, modern communities?
Oh, wow.
When we see rising rates of anxiety and depression around us, are we too quick to medicate the individual while ignoring the fact that the foundational layers of our own social pyramids might be crumbling?
That is exactly the kind of question that makes this exploration worthwhile.
I think so too.
We often look to extreme environments to understand the baseline of human nature. The mind does not break cleanly, like a bone. It requires a holistic, deeply social kind of mending. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden architecture of human resilience. Keep questioning the surface, keep exploring the mechanisms beneath the headlines, and we will see you on the next deep dive.